Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Current Status, and I'm one of your co-hosts here. I'm Puma Schmidt, also known as Exchange Goddess on the Twitters, and I have here Teresa Miller. You want to introduce yourself?
Good evening. I am Teresa Miller, and very excited to be here this evening with my co-hosts and our guest. I'm known on Twitter as 24/7 IT Connect.
And I'm Melissa Palmer. I'm Vemus33 on Twitter. Super excited about tonight's show. So, Exchange Goddess, why don't you tell us a little bit about our special guest tonight?
Our special guest tonight, her name is Stefanie Holland, and she is an attorney. She's actually an assistant general counsel for Harsco Corporation. And the reason why we have her on tonight is with all this hype about, security breaches, data loss, we figured why not talk to someone that's in the legal industry to give us, her take on this. So, Stefanie, you want to introduce yourself and kind of tell us what you've been doing and your story.
Sure. I'm Stefanie Holland, and I can be found on LinkedIn at Stephanie Burns Holland. As Pumala said, I'm an attorney with Harsco Corporation. Harsco is a Fortune 1000 diversified industrials company doing both service and manufacturing in over 35 countries. My background is I started in a law firm, spent some time living in Asia, and now I'm in-house. So I think we'll be able to discuss this evening a little bit about how legal is being affected by the security and IT issues that we're seeing in abundance in the recent past.
Well, I know that a lot of the Twitters out there have a lot of questions, so I think we'll just kind of start right away with one of my favorite topics is IT policies, procedures, standards, especially for large corporations. And one of my biggest pet peeves is when you have an IT policy, there's always an exception to the rule. And when that happens, that creates, more risk. What's your take on that, Stefanie?
I would agree wholeheartedly with you that when you put a policy into place, every time you decide to make an exception to that policy, you are diminishing the value of the policy. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some very legitimate business reasons or other reasons that you might make an exception to a policy, but it's really important to think through those exceptions wholeheartedly. And I would generally advise, and what I do advise my clients, is that the best way to avoid having to make a lot of those exceptions is to step back when you're putting in the policy into place and really try to be collaborative cross-functionally and with the businesses in order to help avoid those exceptions. So, oftentimes large companies, or all companies for that matter, are moving so quickly with policies to try and keep up with technology that moves faster than business and faster than the law, to really try and understand from the business perspective and the other functions how that policy is going to affect the people who are obligated to follow that policy, and step back from there and really try to take a holistic approach to the policy from the beginning. And I do find that while it doesn't avoid all exceptions, it does minimize the number or reduce the number of exceptions that you might get when a policy is put into place, and then all of a sudden you have people going, oh my God, that means I have to, and it becomes problematic for someone in the field who now has a business effect of what that policy means.
But who's required to enforce that policy? Would it be IT, security, or the business? Because I've worked out in the field, and a lot of times we have these policies. For instance, your password policy, and the IT policy says you shouldn't give it to anybody. Don't post it on the sticky note and leave it on your monitor screen. And we know a lot of people do that, and they also give their passwords away to people. Who's responsible to make sure that the users do follow these policies? Because at the end of the day, you are protecting the company's data.
I'm going to be I'm going to be very much a lawyer here, and I'm going to say it depends on the policy. I know the "it depends" answer is never the answer anyone wants to get, but I really do feel it depends on the policy itself. And, you know, part of it is empowering the right people in IT, because that really is your first line defense. If you have a policy that says, you know, you have to change your password every 30 days, and you have someone who's coming to you and saying, well, I only want to change mine once a quarter or once every 6 months, someone in IT has to affect that exception. So I would generally say you need to consider who has to implement that policy and empower them either to say no or give them an more, probably more appropriately, is to give them the appropriate escalation chain and the appropriate steps in order for that exception to either be approved or denied, and give the frontline people who are dealing with, you know, people asking for exceptions the tools to enforce that policy or to escalate to the appropriate people who can say no. Where that really becomes a challenge is with your C-suite.
Yes.
So, oh yeah, I can see that. So, when policy is being created, we've talked a little bit about how we can partner with IT, but it's kind of a bigger circle, isn't it? Where not only is it legal and IT, it's the business, it's communication. So how have you seen that aspect handled? How does the business communicate, or how does legal communicate with the business to IT? How do you create that circle?
Well, I've seen it done very well, and I've seen it done very poorly, in particular when I was in private practice and working with a large variety of companies. And the companies that really seem to have the most effective programs have teams, cross-functional teams and business teams that come together and work collaboratively and then sign off on the policy. So literally treating it like a project with a project manager that works through that team. And for different policies, it might be different people. But for most companies, you'll have a core of people who have the skill sets and the knowledge. So you might have one or two IT professionals who have a very strong security background, and you might have a lawyer who has a very strong background in this area. You might have someone from your corporate communications team who is almost always on the team as sort of a core, and then depending on the policy, you might bring in different people. So if it's your password protection policy, it's very likely different people than it is, say, a policy that says you can't bring in a flash drive or a USB drive and download my documents onto it and carry it around in your back pocket.
I think you really hit the nail on the head. And something you said earlier was every exception diminishes the value of the policy. And I've never heard it said that way before, but I really like it, because I feel like a lot of times when we're talking about these sort of policies, they're put in the afterthought. They're at the end of the project and, oh no, I need to go get everything blessed by IT, security, and legal, so I'm just going to throw something together that I think will get through at the last minute and not really think about it. But when you take this more holistic approach through the whole lifestyle of whatever project you're trying to accomplish, and everybody works hand in hand, I think we're going to end up a lot stronger policies that we're not going to need all the exceptions for if they're planned correctly.
Yeah, Melissa, completely agree, because then you have people coming at the policy development from different perspectives, and they're bringing all of the different issues that they are aware of to the table. I can draft a great policy that sounds really pretty as a lawyer, but I don't necessarily have the skill set to say whether IT could actually even do what I say that I want them to do in an ideal world, and IT very likely doesn't have the visibility to that 30-day password policy. Might be a problem for a salesperson who is on the road and only in the office once every 6 weeks, or works out of a home office and isn't connected to the network, say, in a way that they can change their password with that regularity. And so understanding all of those perspectives, I think, is a very important part of policy deployment. And to your point, Melissa, I find when you take the time to get those voices up front, you do absolutely save time on the back end. A lot of people think, oh, we'll pull it together, we're in a time crunch. You actually normally end up saving time by slowing down at the front end.
I would agree with that too. The policies are there to protect the company, also to protect the employees. Take, for instance, J.P. Morgan Chase, or Morgan Stanley, the internal data theft. That was an employee, that was internal theft. And that actually, I think, is probably more risk than external data breaches, such as malware. How do you feel about that?
I would agree with you. It's probably a bigger risk, and I would defer to the three of you on this, but I think we as a society and our IT teams have spent a lot of time over recent years putting up firewalls and other ways of protecting the outside from getting in. I don't think we always think enough about the fact that especially a disgruntled employee can really wreak havoc. And not that you can completely avoid that, but there are things that you can do to minimize. If I go back to the example with a flash drive, or talking about personal email or not personal email, company email, but access to company email from personal devices with cloud storage these days, and the ability for those employees to download those emails and walk away with sensitive company information and then delete all of that out of their work email, and how is that backed up? Can it be restored? And how can you just sort of prevent that in the front end? Sometimes it's malicious, as I've just described, and I'm going to say more often than not, it's not malicious at all. It's just not knowing any better or any different. It's that person who thinks they're doing the right thing by backing up onto a flash drive, and the flash drive gets lost.
Or they just want their emails. It's simple as that. Maybe they have personal email, in their mailboxes. They just want to save them, and they don't realize that, okay, that PST file does have company data. There's spreadsheets. There's contacts, customer contacts in there. So, I think it also comes down to communication and describing the policy to the users, informing them that, hey, this is what we have in place, and it's here to protect everybody. I think sometimes a lack of communication, there's a disconnect between the business and IT. It always seems like it's IT. They're like this dictatorship, and they're just trying to tell us what to do. So definitely communication between the two business units is definitely helpful in this aspect.
Training as to why you're doing things is really important, because then you can build buy-in. And when you build buy-in, again, we're going back to those cross-functional teams, even if it's only 90% buy-in, most people understand that they're not going to win every argument in a company. But if the majority have bought in, the rest normally come along and are more cooperative with implementing the policy, being earnest in following the policy, and not trying to find workarounds. It's because they understand what the purpose is and why you're doing it, and the security that goes along with it. Going to your example, Pumala, if it's personal emails that came into work, and depending on your company, your policy may or may not allow that, you can, I believe, prevent an employee from downloading a PST file to a USB drive. But what you might say in the policy is, but if there's a personal folder and an employee is leaving the company on good terms, IT will come and help them download just that data. You may or may not want to go that direction. It might be too much of a burden on your IT professionals. How do you sort through and make sure that what's in that folder is truly only personal emails? There's a lot of issues that go along with those types of discussions, but that's a discussion that those teams of people can and should be having when they decide how to implement, what to put in a policy and how to implement it.
You touched on a topic that's pretty hot right now, just a little bit ago, cloud.
Yeah.
Cloud is definitely, I think a lot of people have questions about that. So with going to the cloud, pretty much your data is out there in the sky somewhere, and you don't know where it is. And let's say you are crossing international borders. How does that play out in the legal field now? Because with data in Europe, and the US, and let's say you have an employee that's based in Europe but your data is in the US or vice versa, and there's an e-discovery request that comes through, how does that play in the legal world? Because I know there's some different privacy laws that we have to take into consideration.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Privacy laws vary by jurisdiction. They're some of the strictest in Europe. But if we step back to sort of where your question started, that's an area that legal can provide quite a bit of value add when you're setting up your cloud service in the first place and you're negotiating that contract for the service provider. Legal truly understanding and partnering with IT in reviewing that contract can go a long way in protecting the company by obligating your third-party provider to do or not do certain things. So to go to your example, you may in that contract obligate or attempt to obligate your service provider not to cross borders. So your data in the US needs to stay in US server, your data in Germany needs to stay in a German server, your data in China needs to stay in a China server. It's not always the way that it can be done, but it's something you can look at or regionalize it in areas that have fairly similar laws. Once you cross borders, you are going to need to make sure that you're following the strictest of all of those laws. And that's an area where, again, lawyers can come in and give guidance. Drafting those contracts with those obligations can be a very important part of the process as well. And then indemnifications that can, if that third-party provider doesn't hold up to the obligations you put in there, them compensating to the extent that there's a financial loss. So this is definitely an area that I would recommend that companies remember to bring in lawyers, and lawyers with a strong background. May even take more than one lawyer, and I always hesitate to say you need more than one lawyer on a deal, but you might need a lawyer who has an IT background and a separate lawyer that has a privacy background, or two, depending on what jurisdictions you may be in and where you may be crossing.
What about the decision on what data and what applications to bring to the cloud? Is that something that maybe people should get their legal team involved in?
Absolutely, especially when you're talking about companies that are in the consumer realm, because that's really the area where the most laws are out there that companies are obligated to. So, if you think through the industries that are highly regulated and actually have laws like HIPAA, most people are familiar with that in the healthcare, and there's also a global law in the financial institutions arena that have proactive requirements for companies to protect data. That's the exception to the rule. Most laws with regard to data and data protection are reactionary. There are laws that say, hey, if you have a breach, if information gets out there, you have to tell people. And they're almost all consumer-based. So if you're talking about an industrial company that has a breach and they lose some trade secrets, there's not a whole lot of laws out there in that.
So within the realm of smaller organizations that might not even have legal teams, what kind of advice would you have for them when they're looking at cloud-based services? Is there anything they can do to protect themselves?
The first thing that I would advise to smaller companies and entrepreneurs is $500 to an external lawyer can save you a lot of money down the road. You don't have to go find a high-priced, $800 or $1,000 an hour lawyer in order to have someone who has the background to help you work through some of these concepts and read the contract, and if nothing else, to make sure you understand what the contract means and doesn't mean, and whether that contract is going to give you protection. And in a lot of cases, the contracts, if you're very small, aren't negotiable. A 15-person shop that started out of, the basement of your home isn't likely negotiating a contract with, Microsoft for their cloud storage. But understanding what that contract says and means can also be a very important, actually not can be, is a very important thing for any business owner, so that if you choose to use that software, if you choose to use that cloud storage, and what you put up there, you understand where it goes. And we talk about the cloud as if it's actually up in the sky, but I mean, not saying anything you all don't know, but it's actually, there's a server somewhere holding that, and understanding where that server is. From a disaster preparedness perspective, I recommend that people make sure that that storage is in a different time zone than you are. So if you think about recently when Hurricane Sandy came through, a lot of people who thought they were protected with their secondary storage being at a different site was still a large enough geographic hit that some people actually lost both their primary and their backup.
That was actually a very, very common thing that happened around here. Because, maybe my primary is in New York City, but my secondary is in New Jersey someplace. Both got taken out.
Right.
Yeah, that's kind of, you start to think, okay, they're an hour away from each other. Is that really a DR within an hour? No. I mean, to me, that's not. You should really have it geographically displaced from each other.
Yeah, agreed. And I joke with it. I say it should be a different time zone, but it is more than that. It's probably more of a mileage difference.
What about when your cloud goes down? Now, Verizon recently had an outage this past weekend. It's about 48 hours. And let's say your whole data center is in the cloud, and your cloud provider decides, hey, we need to have a maintenance weekend. I mean, that is a huge impact to the IT department, the business, but it could be a bigger impact. How do you see that when there's such an outage like that for 40 hours? I mean, I see it as dollars lost, but I'm sure there's more to it than just dollars and systems being down and people can't receive emails.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of that goes back to, that can literally be a per customer, depending on your business, per contract obligation that you have legally. Depending on how those terms, and we're just talking from a commercial perspective, but how those contract terms are negotiated, you may have an obligation or not to be up and running in certain circumstances. And so understanding what your company's general policy on it is for your contracts, and having a process, again, for exceptions, and understanding what that risk is. So if you say in your contracts you're going to guarantee to your clients that you won't go down for more than 72 hours, and a salesperson wants that to be rolled back to 48 hours or 24 hours, you might do it for a business reason. But you need to understand and then have IT and legal involved so that risk can be managed, or at least you understand if you go down for 48 hours, like you just said, that you have a potential cost out there to one of your customers. And again, that can vary dramatically. So you've got both the business isn't running cost, and then the possible liability depending on the obligations and other commitments that you made.
I guess that brings the question, for the IT department, do you back up your cloud? Because I know we've talked about in previous episodes where, okay, so you have the cloud, but how do you back up your cloud? And the Verizon example is, a perfect example of that. Should you back up your cloud?
I'm going to say there's probably, in most of the time, no legal requirement to. Again, with some of those highly regulated industries, there's some exceptions. But you'll say, generally speaking, with business, that's your business problem to deal with. Consumers being more protected by the legal scheme here in the U.S. regulated. From a disaster preparedness perspective, I would generally say yes, absolutely. You should be figuring out a way to back up that data. And it sounded like Melissa, has some experience in this. Complete data loss that way can have just a huge impact. And the smaller the company, I'm sure there are companies that never came back.
How many startups have you heard of just completely folding because some cloud provider shut their doors and everything was in the cloud and they lost everything?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and you look at some of the cloud-based options too, like Microsoft and the Exchange Online. You can't restore a mailbox. So you really have to take a close look at how you're going to get your data back, what retention policies you're going to use in order to even go with a service like that.
Yeah, and Teresa, retention policies are something that companies really should take very seriously. If you're going to have one, you really need to follow it, because as soon as you stop following it, you might as well not have one at all. It can actually be worse than not having one at all. If you're thinking about this from, go back to what Kumala had said about e-discovery and those types of issues in the litigation realm. If you're asked to produce something, you can use your policy if it's consistently implemented and is within the parameters of the law as a justification to not provide information. But if you're not consistently adopting that policy, then you've lost that protection as a company.
So in the example of, let's say, your policy states that you back up your email, but it doesn't really classify, let's say, PST files, and the user has a PST file on their local laptop. Now a litigation comes up. Are you required to find that PST file, or is it just backup email in the data center?
I'm going to say it depends again. It can depend jurisdictionally.
It's the same thing in IT. It always depends. I guess it's the same thing in legal. It always depends.
But I'm going to say, yes, you can be obligated by the courts to go find that information. I would be prepared as a company for that possibility.
That's a tough one, because local PST files, any Exchange admin will tell you, they're just a nightmare. Especially if they're on local systems, and users can copy them off and take them away and delete them from their local hard drives, and there you go, you don't have it anymore, and they walk off and they go to a competitor, and they're all your customer contacts. I mean, we've seen it happen. It's quite possible. So it's one of those things where, does IT implement a policy that says no PST files? I guess we go back to that policy thing again. It's really, it's a balance between protecting the business, but also empowering them and giving them productivity and mobility.
Yeah, you're correct. We're looping all the way back to policies and that cross-functional team again. So the business, team who might talk about how important it is that those PSTs be on local drives so that their people in the field have really easy access to the information, and the practical, if there's a litigation and you have to produce that, IT being able to get at those files and produce in compliance with a court order. I've had some clients that just disabled the ability to export the PST files entirely. Everything had to stay in the email system and be backed up under the company policy. That's on one end of the spectrum, and I've worked with other companies where they basically had no controls or protections at all, had a policy in place and trusted that employees would follow that policy. And I think most of the time with employees, not to say that there aren't people who get disgruntled and do things intentionally, but I'm going to say most of the time it's not intentional. It's either lack of understanding, lack of knowledge, or an accident. But we can be our own worst enemies in that front.
Yeah, that sounds true. I mean, how many times do people just accidentally save something to their USB drive or whatever because they think they're doing the right thing, but they're not really doing it. They're violating a ton of policies they might not even be aware of.
Or how many times have you all received a phone call from someone who accidentally hit delete and they're panicking that they...
Yeah. Oops,
Nothing's ever really deleted.
It's backed up to the network. It's backed up on the storage array. No, we can't help you.
Yeah, it's shift delete. One thing I wanted to bring up is this new law that Obama is, trying to pass. I think we've read up a little bit on it, but I don't think there's a lot of information out there.
Yeah, not a whole lot yet. I think it was Monday or Tuesday that he proposed to Congress a new law. This this is what he's attempting to do is address the fact that most states have a law similar to this that requires companies that have a breach of consumer information or personal information that they notify the people who have had their data from a privacy perspective, from an identity theft perspective, so that they can take action to protect themselves. Not a whole lot of detail out on this law yet. I think it's an interesting concept to nationalize it. I think it definitely helps reduce the fact that right now almost every state is different. I'm sure there will be a vigorous debate around whether the ability to wait 30 days actually a lot of damage can be done in 30 days if your personal data was stolen. And on the flip side, trying to react, companies can only react so quickly, and they may not even know who all's data was stolen, at first, and they're trying to figure that out. So I think it's going to be a lively and an interesting debate that we'll watch with our elected representatives.
Wow, it's almost. I think time's almost up, guys. That went real quick.
Went very fast.
I think it's a big topic right now, and we saw a lot of stuff in 14.
There's definitely a lot. We'll probably have to have you back on the show again, Stephanie, because I think there's a lot of questions out there, especially BYOD, and we haven't really touched on that, and that could be a whole episode on itself.
Yep.
I'm sure a lot of people have questions. I know I do.
Yep. I'm happy to come back. We didn't touch reputation risk, BYOD, and a number of things. So.
Yes, reputation risk, the whole Sony. Yes, that's. I think that one will continue to play out as more is discovered on the whole incident. But thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you for joining us, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
This was definitely great. And thank you, everybody, for watching us. And we'll be back next week for another episode of Current Status. Thank you.
Have a great evening. Yep. Thank you.